Hello, 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 hello. I am back with more Cachexia. So, last time, what happened last time? Two fake out nightmares happened. One where, Esther experienced one of her greatest fear, which is that Sena actually has a big poo-poo head and doesn't like her. And also felt mysteriously drawn to the catacombs. And when she got in, she was like, "I'm happy," and then she got woken up by Sena and apparently was screaming. And then the other one, she had sort of a prophetic dream of maybe what happened to Isaiah. That he and Sena got into a fight, and Sena ran out, Isaiah went after her. Turns out she went into the catacombs, and he goes in, and gets lost because they're enormous, and then spooky ghosties get him. But, like, that doesn't quite line up with the established facts of reality. Like, if he, say, died in the catacombs, how did the door get locked again and the key end up somewhere in the woods? He would have had the key on him. And also, does that mean that did Sena escape or not? Well, maybe. Or maybe she's the spooky ghosty. That seems to be something that the game is leaning towards. That Sena is, like, not alive. That's my guess. It could be that Isaiah escaped the spooky ghosties, locked the tomb, with Sena inside perhaps, and discarded the key while running away. That's one plausibility. That was most of what happened yesterday, besides some more bonding. So let's get back to it. Yeah, this was right after the second nightmare, and it's like when it was like, oh, it's a nightmare, I'm like, oh god, I need to break from this. What on earth had she seen? It was horrible. So horrible. And yet it had completely vanished from her mind, leaving behind no trace except her frantically racing heartbeat. What was that, anyway? To her surprise, the spot behind her on the bed was empty. It was still dark, so why had Sena left? And yeah, the idea that Sena might be a spooky ghosty lines up with the possibility that the Pale is caused by spooky ghosties, and so, like, what if Sena caused Esther's the Pale? Which, like, I don't know why she would, considering that Esther traveled a long distance to get here. But if there's any connection, it's that Esther's eye color, which is said to be affected by the Pale, is kind of similar to Sena's color scheme. You know, a person's color scheme. But, like, the colors she wears, the white and pink, kind of, the very, very pale whitish pink of Esther's eyes, it's kind of similar. Then as she stared numbly at the white sheets, she realized she could hear something. The soft pattering of rain. The rain falls. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. If she hadn't awoken in the middle of the night, it was just a dark, gloomy morning. Pulling herself to the side of the bed, Esther shifted to stand on her feet. Oh, it's one of those days. Oh, my knees! When her legs suddenly started to give way, she managed to grab the bedpost to steady herself just in time. A dull, numbing sensation spread along her spine, slowly draining the energy from her surrounding muscles as it traveled further downward. It was painfully familiar, the same reaction she'd felt so many times before, on dark days when she tried to drag herself up right after awakening. But since she'd been staying at the manor, she hadn't experienced it again fully. Until today. Esther drew in a deep, unsteady breath. She could do it. Even while acutely aware of her own weakness, the feeling of being a severed puppet, she could still force herself to move. Gingerly, carefully. Trying to suppress her fear of falling at any moment. Moving around on the bed's perimeters, holding onto the edge with one hand, Esther slowly staggered over to her folded clothes. The crippling numbness gradually became less noticeable as she dressed herself, her subconscious mind adjusting to the nearly dead weight of each limb. Part of her was begging to lie back down, to try to sleep off the debilitation, but she wanted to stay awake, to go and greet Sena, to face the day, to make progress with Isaiah's research. Anything, no matter how small, was better than surrendering completely. as I fight back the yawns that come back. After steadying herself for a few minutes, Esther made her way down the stairs, adjusting to the weight a little more with every step. She could see Saina's small figure seated in the chair before the fire, holding a mug of tea in her hands. Ah. When she noticed Esther, Saina blinked, her eyes drifting away rather suddenly. She took a long sip of her tea, before lowering the cup with a faint smile on her lips. It seemed different somehow, thin, uncertain. Hello, Esther. I woke up early today and couldn't get back to sleep. I've already been doing things around the house for a little bit. Since it's raining, I'm going to clean the parlor and the rooms at the back of the manor. I don't use much. But you can go ahead and spend the day with Papa's research if you like. I've already had breakfast, but I left some for you in the kitchen. There was something unusually strained about Saina's voice, as if the casual brightness of her words was forced, an attempted show instead of her normal easy warmth. Sorry I'm sapping your energy again. I just couldn't help it. My ghostly needs, Esther! Well then, I'm going to start with one of the old storage rooms, I think. I'll see you later, Finishing the rest of her tea in a gulp, she sat her empty cup at the end table, swiftly rising to her feet. Yes. Thank you for the meal. It's all right. If you want anything else before dinner, there's plenty in the pantry. Good luck with the research. After a brief pause, she turned to hurry off towards the stairs, her swift footfalls echoing through the foyer. Her absence left Esther with a twisted knot in her gut, a sudden, almost nauseated fear that she'd done something horribly wrong. But how? Saina had been acting perfectly fine the previous night, even curling up tightly against her for comfort. She didn't seem sick and hadn't mentioned a headache, so it seemed unlikely for pain to be the cause of it. It's guilt for her ghostly misdeeds! Perhaps she was just in a bad mood. Man, if I'm right about all this, and... like, I don't know what's worse, that my theory that Saina is the spooky ghosty is right, or if it's wrong. I don't know which is worse, actually. Not everyone could be happy and warm for every moment of their waking lives. There was no use in overthinking it now, especially since it was probably... it would hit me like a truck. Nothing. It only unnerved her because of the resemblance to her previous dream. That was all. That was all. After forcing her tightened stomach to eat some of the food Saina prepared for her. It's weird to see that. It's not incorrect, but it's like, that does seem a little weird. The apostrophe D for had on someone's name. It's like, ooh, that's weird. Like, I don't have any issue with itted or something like that, but like Jimmy'd? Prepared for her, Esther returned to Isaiah's study, but as she reached for the door, she noticed it was fully shut, and she left it that way yesterday. She couldn't remember much, not beyond the dizzy spell that had overtaken her. And all the books on ghosts are gone! Once she'd slipped inside the study, Esther lit a few candles to relieve the gray gloom, shivering a little from the cold. The study didn't feel particularly unsettling or eerie to her anymore. Instead, it brought her a strange sense of comfort, as a place she could connect with somehow. Picking up the remaining books and papers from the shelf she started yesterday, Esther sat down at Isaiah's desk and pulled over a candle. Despite the heavy lethargy weighing down her body, she was still determined to get through at least a little bit of reading today. Even if her efforts were ultimately fruitless, it was better than doing nothing. Ugh. As she picked up one of the books, a long, rolled-up piece of paper stuck beneath it suddenly fluttered onto her lap. The reasons why my daughter is a ghost.txt. Once she'd smothered it across the desk, Esther saw a familiar scribble of Isaiah's handwriting, though this piece seemed a little neater, more formal. He even titled it, albeit haphazardly, at the top of the page. Preliminary findings on God spirits! Propping her chin up on one hand, she leaned forward in her chair and began to read. Man, imagine if she found these out of order, right? Note to Jeremiah. Kindly read over these pages and tell me, quite honestly, if I sound like a madman. I certainly feel like one. I penned it half in jest, thinking I might turn it into an abstract for an academy publication. I was trying to do a joke there where I noticed my stammer, and, like, emphasized it, but then that stammer emphasization turned into another stammer. Man, that really was a 7-lane pileup. Before remembering that I told the head he was a sniveling little bureaucrat with the mental facilities of a mosquito. The mosquitoes have been bothering me lately. When you clap a mosquito and you open your hands and it just flies out and it's like, cheater! You can't do that! I got you! Still, old habits remain difficult to shake. Perhaps you might publish it under your name if you think any of it may hold water. At the very least, you might make some of the rusty old codgers' hearts give out from the mention of anything remotely metaphysical. Preliminary findings on God spirits. A treatise on the Arafel and the pale Cachexia. Over the course of several years of research, I have discovered a remarkable amount of literature on the universal presence of God spirits, entities lesser known as the Arafel. In essence, they are a formless energy, one that can travel from a human surroundings into a physical body. What attracts them the most is the power of strong emotion, the waves of energy released by feelings such as despair, frustration, anger, and of course, love. However, when they enter a host, they will begin to consume all of their energy, numbing their bodily strength as well as the intensity of their emotions. Yeah, spooky ghosties cause the pale. Still, as tempting as it is remains to simplify and generalize them, the Arafel do not appear to be creatures of evil. It seems more accurate to describe them as forces of nature, following a primeval impulse to survive at any cost. They feed off the energy of consciousness itself, leeching from both the impulses of the nervous system and the soul's connection to the universe. The informal title of God spirits comes from the fact that they are simply too overpowering for the current human mind. To coexist with them, it would require a divine level of inexhaustible strength. As for their existence in the world, for the vast majority of cases they are completely invisible to the eye. From my research, it seems likely that almost every human unknowingly carries at least several of these spirits within them, but displaces their draining effects under different names. Curiously enough, the act of becoming overly conscious of this form presence seems to attract further Arafel to the host. There appears to be no limit to the amount that can infect a body, so that would explain why earlier writings said, like, don't talk about the Arafel now, that's the naughty thing, and it's because talking about the Arafel is how you get more Arafel. Indeed, the more that dwell within a person, the more spirits are drawn to them in a slow, steady loop. However, there have been several strange cases of the complete opposite occurring. A pure vessel, hitherto untouched by the spirit's invasions, can suddenly become highly susceptible to them within a very short period of time. Extreme stress and powerful emotion may act like a magnet for the Arafel, drawing them in, if present, from the surrounding individuals and environment like an immense vortex. So if Sena isn't one of the spooky ghosties, then she's getting the spooky ghosties that she was previously unspooky ghostied, but now that she's been in contact with Esther, she's getting spooky ghosted up. This may also occur with those already possessed, although it is even less common, for these spirits rarely congregate in large numbers. But the most interesting facet of these spirits is the potential connection to a common incurable disease, that which is known as the pale Cachexia. If the Arafel do in fact exist, their possible relation to the pale is one that cannot be ignored. Indeed, if one connected earlier writings on the God spirits with the instances of those who've recovered from the pale, one could glean the true nature of a possible cure. With that said, the only potential cures one could surmise are disheartening, to say the least. One is virtually impossible, and the other impossibly cruel. I will discuss these methods in an attempt to learn how they might be potentially achieved, but attempting either of them with our current knowledge of the Arafel would be thoroughly foolish. The crueler method is the more feasible of the two, but it would ultimately require a sacrifice. You transfer the spirits into a sacrifice. Esther quickly turned the paper over, her heart skipping a beat. It was empty. No continuation at all. But in his preface at the top, Isaiah had mentioned multiple pages. The others were close by then, surely. Scattering her piles of books across the desk, she searched through them with intense, increasingly anxious focus. It had to be here somewhere. It had to be. But even after she combed through every book, went through every pile, and even ran back over to the bookshelf to search through it. So yeah, it makes sense then if Sena is being infected by the spirits. That's why Esther has been feeling better since she's been there. It's not so much the company, the positivity, the motivation. It's because she's leaking spooky ghosties into her sacrifice, which is Sena. So that's probably what the leading up to. Not that Sena is responsible for Esther's the Pale, but she's actually responsible for alleviating it. And her having not been there in the morning could be like why Esther felt worse this morning. She didn't have her siphon, although they hadn't been sleeping together in her early days here, where Esther also was feeling better. So it's probably not. It probably doesn't require that close of proximity. She found nothing. I can't believe it, she muttered to herself, so stunned and crestfallen that the words came from her without thought. The era fell. Esther still found it nearly impossible to believe they existed, but if they did, then Isaiah had to be on the right track. Even if he sounded skeptical of the potential cures, they might hint at something she could pursue further. It was without a doubt the very best lead she'd found so far. Why then did her luck have to suddenly run out like this? Damn it. It's here. I know it is. Clenching her jaw, she began to comb her way through entire rows of shelves, pulling out every stray piece of paper she laid eyes on. It felt like fate was taunting Esther, dangling the key to her condition in front of her face before hiding it away again. The missing pages were simply too much of a cruel coincidence. Why, oh why, were these papers the only ones she couldn't find? Because Isaiah probably destroyed them because they were too cruel. So it's worth mentioning, of course, that Isaiah, also having the Pale, did not seem to transfer spirits into Sena. She was as bubbly as ever the whole time that they lived together, it seems. So, either he was consciously, not transferring them, or it requires some sort of connection that he didn't have with her. Eventually, after what seemed like hours of fruitless searching, Esther fell back on the dusty bed in defeat. The frustration from such valuable information slipping through her fingers was all but soul-crushing. There was a chance it could still be here, or somewhere else in the house, but a fresh wave of exhaustion crashed upon her, sapping away any remaining strength she had to go hunting for it. Oh, excuse me. Curling up into a little ball, she closed her eyes, listening to the drone of rainfall as the storm carried steadily on. An endless storm so heavy it seemed like it might wash away everything. She wished it would. She wished she could wake up to a new morning, to Sena's happy greeting, to a productive day in the garden and research in the study. If only sleep could bring something new, something different, something better. Something beyond a brief reprieve from the everyday burdens, the problems that were always there whenever she woke up. But it never could. Smiling grimly at her own foolish thoughts, she sank into the arms of a long and restless slumber. And had another prophetic nightmare, I imagine. She's probably not awake. A quiet, steady knocking stirred Esther awake. I've been hurt before. Press X to doubt. Hours must have passed. A much heavier darkness had replaced the overcast gloom from earlier. She slowly swung her legs over the side of the bed, rubbing her bleary eyes with a hand. If anything, the uneasy rest had only made her more tired. Esther? Are you in there? Yes. You can come in, Sena. Probably in a nightmare. After a moment, the door slowly creaked open. Sena stepped into view with obvious hesitation, as if she were afraid of what she might find inside. Esther? Are you all right? Meow. She nodded. Have you eaten anything since this morning? No. I haven't been hungry. Ah. Well, there's some dinner left over in the kitchen if you'd like it later. Thank you. Her reply faded into a long, uncomfortable pause that seemed to stretch on and on. In reality, the silence only lasted a few seconds, but it was crushing enough to drive Esther past her typical avoidance of confrontation. Have I upset you somehow? You've been acting differently today. Meow. No, you haven't done anything. I'm sorry if I made you feel like that. I've just been thinking about a lot today. Meow. The initial relief she felt from Sena's reassurance soon faded into uncertainty. Even if she had done something wrong, Sena might be too afraid of hurting her feelings to tell her directly. Esther, do you mind if we take a walk outside? It feels like a long time since I've really seen the moon and stars. Of course, let's go. Sena smiled at her faintly, but it seemed just as strained as it did that morning, if not more so. A stronger sense of anxiety began to gnaw at her stomach, even as she followed the smaller girl outside, trying to reassure herself that she hadn't really done anything wrong. Esther couldn't escape the uneasy thought seeping into her head. With the cold night air settling on their skin, they slowly made their way across the manor grounds. The silence had a deafening quality to it, far different from even the quiet shyness of their first meeting. It was as if Sena no longer knew what to say to her. A vast distance had opened up between them, so inexplicable and one-sided that it left Esther horribly confused. Was she in another dream? Likely. Or had her earlier dream crossed over into reality? Or more likely, perhaps her dream only reflected the reality that had been there all along. In the midst of their quiet walk, they wandered into the cemetery, through the maze of scattered graves. Sena seemed to be heading towards the pond by the mausoleum, her slow footsteps forming a path through the long sinister shadows cast by the headstones. Being here at night unnerved Esther by itself, but with Sena remaining so eerily silent, it made her heart start to race even faster. And as impossible and nonsensical as it was, it felt like a third presence was right behind them. Me! It's me! Or all around them. Arr! Unable to contain her reflexes, she threw a swift glance over her shoulder, but there was nothing her eyes could see. Your special eyes. Noticing her anxious behavior, Sena gave Esther a look of confusion. Bow! In response, Esther quickly lowered her gaze. It was almost as if she was going insane, blurring dreams and reality, sensing odd presences, falling into pieces at the first hint of Sena's displeasure. Fears that she couldn't even share with her friend because Esther was afraid of her judgment too. Even more than it frightened her, the thought filled her with a deep sadness. The roulette of life. Sad for no reason, sad for no reason, sad for no reason. Boom! Happy to be alive, happy to be alive, still sad. Before long, the cold gray stone of the mausoleum was towering over them, but as they approached the pond beside it, Sena slowed to a halt. Esther paused beside her, wondering why they had stopped. Could we stay here for a little while? Could you go inside while I lock the door and never come back? Or at least I think I'll stay. If it's too cold for you, you can always head back to the fireplace. I'm fine. Ah, that's good. I wish I'd brought a blanket for the grass now. The grass is cold. Tuck it in. Sighing softly, she lowered herself onto the ground, the hem of her dress spilling over to lightly touch the pond's surface. After a brief pause, Esther followed suit, pulling her own skirt in close to her legs. Another long stretch of silence clouded over them. Esther felt acutely aware of the cold, wet grass beneath her, bringing a sharp chill to her bones. Bones! As her skirt absorbed it. Unable to bring her gaze over towards Sena, she watched the stray leaves drifting aimlessly across the water, graced by only faint traces of moonlight. I've been thinking about Papa a lot lately. The way he was in the weeks before he died. At last, Sena's quiet voice rose through the darkness. Devoid of her usual energy, her words were barely above a whisper, slow and monotone. Even though he'd always had the pail, he fought against it so hard all the time. He worked all day long in the gardens, forced himself to eat when he grew too thin, and he always rose at dawn, even when his constant nightmares kept him awake. And he took care of me all the while, always doing so many things for me. A pained, resigned longing filled her voice, devoid of any trace of hope. Oh, yeah, speaking of which, Sena, you got that, that cat plush that he made for you? What happened to that? Assuming that was real. I mean, seeing that was also part of the dream. When Esther finally turned to face her, Sena was gazing off in the distance, past the pond and into the thick, unending darkness that lay beyond. Her first instinct was to try to comfort the other girl, but at the same time she had the sense that Sena wanted to keep speaking. This was the first time she had ever addressed her father's death with someone, and perhaps the first time she processed it fully. Those last few weeks, when he suddenly started changing, they were so awful, I don't even want to remember them. Papa's face had this horrible, hollow look, like there wasn't even a soul inside his body anymore. Anyway, that's what's going to happen to you. Look forward to it. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't even come out of his locked room, no matter how much I cried and begged him to. Curling her knees up to her chest, she rocked slowly back and forth, still staring blankly into the darkness. The only time I saw Papa come out was late at night. There's a squeater! I'm watching it. I'm gonna get it. No! Yeah, I'm watching you. You go up there and you stay up there. Yeah, you know what for. You know I'll get you. Don't think I've forgotten about you up there. Mosquitoes, the state bird. He thought I had gone to sleep, but I was waiting in the hallway like every night for any chance to see him again. But now I almost wish I hadn't seen him. Though her gaze finally drifted over to Esther, Sena almost seemed to be looking right through her. She was somewhere out far, far away, deep inside the recesses of her own memory. I watched him run downstairs, desperately checking the locks on all the doors, barricading them, covering up the windows. He was mumbling under his breath, wild things about being haunted by shadows, things that were going to kill him. It felt like I was watching him go mad. If they truly did exist, could it have been the Arafel that drove Isaiah into madness? It seemed possible, yet something struck Esther about it as odd. Isaiah had described the increase of spirits in a host as slow and steady, not something so sudden. But why? Why do you think he changed so quickly? Was it something you did? Was it your fault? An expression Esther had never witnessed on Sena before suddenly crossed her features, darkening them. Just before his health started to get worse, we had an argument. It was the only time I ever shouted at Papa. I was so angry back then. Before I calmed down and I realized what I'd done, I really just wanted to die. I felt like he was so disappointed in me, his troublesome, ungrateful daughter. I didn't respect his wishes. I didn't understand that he was only trying to protect me. All I did was make him feel alone again, right until the moment he died. No tears formed in her eyes. Perhaps she had already wept too many times over it, or else her grief went beyond any outward expression. She simply kept hugging her knees against her chest, staring into Esther without seeing her. She wanted so very, very desperately to comfort her friend. Very, 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 very. To reach out and pull Sena into a hug, giving her the reassurance that she'd never had since Isaiah's death. I'm on high alert for the mosquitoes in my room, but Esther felt frozen in place. There was a depth to Sena's sorrow that she would never understand. Perhaps that was why the other girl had suddenly grown so cold toward her. All the words that came to Esther's mind were too shallow, unable to reach the pain that Sena had buried away in order to continue living. Let's turn the music up a little bit. She understood that terrible thought, and yet the silence of Sena's pain was too agonizing for her to stand any longer. It's not your fault, Sena. You can't blame yourself for his illness. It had nothing to do with you. He died because he couldn't put his spirits into you. What a... When Esther blurted out her first instinctive response, Sena showed no reaction. Sena, you were only a child. I know you never meant to hurt Isaiah. Please don't blame yourself. You didn't do anything wrong. Again, her words were only met with a numb silence. She couldn't tell if Sena even heard her, or was ignoring her, or if she was making the other girl feel worse by even saying anything. And yet, despite herself, Esther couldn't bite back the question tugging at her mind. The reason why Sena felt so guilty. She had to find a way to understand it somehow. Hey, I don't suppose you went into the mausoleum and then he chased after you and died in there or something, right? The argument you had with your father. Can I ask what it was about? No! Finally, her words triggered a response. Sena's eyes suddenly refocused on her face, holding a strange mixture of fright and revulsion. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. I really don't want to talk about it after all. Swiftly turning away from Esther, she shook her head vehemently. It was impossible not to feel stung by the rejection, even though she knew she had stepped too far. The reflective atmosphere grew tense and uncomfortable again, each second grating by like a loud discordant noise. Nothing. Esther, is it alright if I have some time alone? When Sena quietly spoke again, Esther's body abruptly froze up. Man, the adverbs and adjectives just continue to pour out. It was like an icy knife had just driven inside her chest, carving straight through her heart. The back of her eyes started to burn, and a lump formed at the back of her throat, but with a deep breath, Esther managed to numb herself to the reaction. Wordlessly, she rose to her feet. Unlike her earlier desire to stay close to Sena, she now felt the urgent need to put distance between them. Without giving Esther another glance, the smaller girl buried her face against her arms. It was clear that trying to speak with her would achieve nothing. There was an almost tangible outer shell around Sena, dividing her from the rest of the world. Turning away, Esther began to trudge back towards the manor. She couldn't fully process things at first. The world seemed surreal, as if she had yawned while reading a sentence. As if she had entered a completely different universe from the one she'd been living in the past few weeks. You know, recently I watched the half A-Press Boulders video for Mario 64 with commentary. But in order to get this star, first I have to explain to you about parallel worlds. I do build up a lot of speed. It takes me about 12 hours. When she started to analyze it all, to imagine how things would play out from here, it felt like her mind was too clouded to contemplate more than a few moments ahead. Before she knew it, she was standing back in the manor, staring blankly at the stairs. For a moment, she considered sleeping on the sofa. Sena clearly didn't want to see her, and returning to the living room was a good reminder that Esther was only a temporary guest. But the more she reflected on the idea, the more it seemed like a childish, pathetic ploy for sympathy. A subconscious attempt to guilt Sena, to gain her pity. It was better to just rest in the bedroom, even if she did risk making the other girl angry at her instead. Betty, by time, Sena, come and sleep. Sleep, however, soon proved impossible. Despite the fatigue that still hung over her, strings of bitter thoughts kept warming into Esther's mind, investing it with further doubts and uncertainties. All these things she could have said to comfort Sena better, to give her the support she was clearly longing for. An endless well of missed opportunities and imagined outcomes, one where they had reconciled, not gone their separate ways. She hadn't done anything wrong. The rational, level-headed part of her realized that perfectly well. But another, louder part of her said it was all her fault. She should have worked harder, acted more lively, learned how to understand Sena better. Esther wasn't the one who deserved pity. She wasn't the one who'd lost her father and had been living in isolation since the beginning. She'd been so privileged in comparison, and yet she still had the nerve to feel sorry for herself. Those thoughts clouded in her head like screaming voices, drowning out every rational plea to absolve herself of guilt. Sena deserves better. She'd be better off alone than with someone like you. Stupid, self-centered girl. Never making progress, always falling back into the same patterns of thought. And no matter how much she reassured you, it meant nothing. You're hopelessly lost in your own head. So very, very, very selfish. She tossed and turned, desperately praying for sleep to finally come and relieve her again. Until at some point, the bedroom door finally opened. After a long pause, Esther heard the light padding of Sena's footsteps approaching the bed with clear reluctance. A drawer opened, clothes shuffling as she changed into her nightgown. Then a small weight pressed down the mattress beside her, and the cover shifted upwards. She was lying facing away from Sena, and she could sense the other girl was facing away from her too. It felt so strange. And then she woke up from the nightmare. Good night, Esther. The soft, nearly inaudible whisper completely caught her off guard. It was so quiet, she almost missed it. Sena must have been unsure whether she was still awake or not. She wanted to say something in return, anything, in the vain hope that it would finally break the awful tension between them. But she couldn't. A mortified guilt kept her petrified, too ashamed to and afraid to even acknowledge the other girl. So she laid in silence, pretending she was fast asleep. Eventually, Sena's breathing fell into a slow, steady rhythm. As upset and hurt as she was, listening to the quiet sound helped soothe Esther, if only a little bit. It proved enough to help her drift slowly off, somewhat comforted by the fact that Sena had come to rest beside her instead of downstairs. The circling thoughts in her head disintegrated little by little, falling into incoherent images and pieces, until at last, her consciousness finally faded away. Alright, now it's time for a nightmare sequence. Or at the very least, an Isaiah sequence. The disease is now reaching its final stages. A steady degeneration of a patient's physical and mental state, with brief episodes of elevated energy and intense panic. These symptoms are occasionally seen in those who suffer from the pale for an extended period. There is still no documented case of recovery from such an advanced progression of the disease. I do not fully understand the cause of my sudden decline, but I suspect it was invoked by a powerful fear. The hallucinations I suffered inside the crypt caused me significant stress, which likely increased the pale's aggressiveness. When I awoke on the ground outside the mausoleum, it was already nearly morning. I suspect I must have entered a delusional panic as I fled from what I witnessed. Whether they were aberrations of the Arafel or simply a reflection of my unstable mental condition, it no longer feels relevant in my last term of illness. Sena, of course, had never entered the catacombs. After our conflict, she ran to my study to wait for me, in a twist of fate the one place I never thought of to search. In the weeks since then, my previously abated symptoms have not only returned, but triggered a rapid deterioration of my health. There is little I can do but continue to study and write, making use of my remaining time in the hopes I may... Bleh. The pen fell from Isaiah's fingertips, clattering onto the desk. Blinking, he steadied his untrembling hand with morbid interest. His pale, skeletal fingers were mottled with ink, like a disease had discolored his pallid flesh. Between a loss of motor control and energy, it was becoming increasingly difficult to write. It served as a constant, painful reminder for the impending reality he was forced to accept. He was withering away. Both his body and his mind were breaking down. Soon he would no longer be recognizable to himself, or to Sena. He couldn't bring himself to speak of it to her. So, the nightmare sequence of Isaiah following, quote, unquote, following Sena into the catacombs happened, but he was hallucinating. Which has layered upon another layer of, how do I put this? Of the thing you're not supposed to do in writing. It was all a dream endings, even to a short part of a story. Bad. But even for that to be unreliable, worse. It's one thing to have an unreliable narrator. It's another thing to, I don't know, just be unreliable. The thought of making her cry again, leaving that as one of the last memories they would share with each other. It was too painful to even consider. The almanacs, directions to the city. The rest of my damned gold. Oh, where is it? Shuffling through and stacking up his papers, Isaiah attempted to work himself into a flurry of impatient, productive activity. It was his usual method of distancing himself from things that he didn't want to think about, but this time, the effort was met with abject failure. Tears blurred his vision, burning behind his eyes no matter how hard he glared. They spilled over and dragged down his sharp cheekbones, falling onto the layers of parchment and soft muffled patter. How would she think of him when he was gone? Would she hate him? It would be fully deserved, with how much he'd failed her as a father. He had come so close to abandoning her at the orphanage, even if that would have led to her having a better family. A life in the city, a childhood surrounded by friends, a world beyond the boundaries of this forest. A world that perhaps she could still find happiness in, even if it meant leaving him behind. remarkably well adjusted for what amounts to a wild child. No, it's too late. Far too late for me to ever give her that. You want that? He mumbled under his breath, clenching his jaw tightly. Far too late. The best he could do was to help Sana provide for herself, to live freely and happily when he was gone. That was all. He repeated those words inside his mind, trying desperately to believe them. He was hopeless, powerless. There was nothing more he could do. Nothing more. A nauseating, guilty weight gnawed at his stomach. Slowly he began to reach for the fallen quill. His fingers frail and trembling as they brushed its feather. If he could only just explain himself to her. If he could go back and remake everything, patch over all of his choices and falsehoods, all of his misguided words. But she only had one childhood, and when he died, it would be over. There was no time left for forgiveness. As he clutched his head with both hands, hoarse sobs began to leak from his throat, a pathetic noise that he loathed to hear. Grief and anger, fear and self-hatred, guilt and final resignation. Blankly staring at the wall, a stream of wretched tears swallowing his words, all remaining thoughts dissolving into empty regret. He wept. A beautiful sunny morning! She stood before the window, gazing up into the clear sky as she carefully buttoned her blouse. Sana was already gone. Just like the previous day, her side of the bed had been neatly remade, the sheets tucked in beneath her pillow and smoothed to perfection. Meow. As Esther descended the stairs, she could hear the birds keeping up their cheerful chorus outside. It felt warmer today. Summer was steadily approaching, and soon everything would be bright, beautiful, and flowering. Nearly a year ago, she'd set out during this same warm weather, full of determination, putting all of her faith into the plan she'd carefully mapped out. And now, after all this time, her closest lead was crumbling into dust. Perhaps it had been foolish to expect anything more. In the empty parlor, Esther saw a small note left out on the desk. Well, while I wait for that to cliffhang, I mean, Esther, you have learned a good deal. You've learned that the disease is probably caused by spooky ghosties and that modern medicine won't be able to do anything about it, so you gotta do some sort of spiritual mumbo-jumbo. And that the two cures are either impossible or cruel. And of course, we can surmise that by cruel means with a sacrifice. You could... Gather round, this prisoner has been sent to execution by spooky ghosties pouring into him. You could use human sacrifices to cure hopefully more than one person. You should have at least figured that out, Esther. She hesitated to pick it up. Somehow she felt like she already knew what it would say. D's nuts. Dear Esther. I liked that game. When we first made our arrangement, I was being too selfish, so I changed my mind. You don't have to worry about helping me with the chores anymore. I can handle things by myself. I think you should focus on finishing with Papa's research instead. I doubt there's too much left to check, is there? If you spend the next few days just going through the bookshelves, it'll be much faster and more practical than what we're doing now. Wouldn't you agree? I set some food out for you in the kitchen. Please eat something so you can stay healthy. I'll see you tonight. The nauseated, anxious feeling in her stomach made eating seem beyond unthinkable. But Sana was right. If she wanted to finish going through Isaiah's research, she had to keep up a semblance of strength. Esther didn't want to burden her any longer. Read these books and get the fuck out of my house. After forcing herself to gulp down a small amount of food, Esther made her way back to the study. Being here so early in the morning, especially on such a beautiful day, felt strangely wrong. In mornings like this, they often went out to the stream or had breakfast in the garden. Sana had promised to show Esther more of her favorite picnic spots soon. Attempting to force away her intrusive thoughts, Esther resumed her search for the missing pages. But the dull, unrewarding nature of the task left her mind far too free to wander, and naturally, it kept returning to her situation with Sena. Slowly, she was beginning to piece together what had likely happened. Yesterday, the study door was closed, even though she'd left it open. It was possible that Sena had shut it while passing by, but more likely, she'd been inside and found the journal entry Esther had pulled out. With a sinking feeling, she checked to confirm her suspicions, and sure enough, the page was missing. Not only was it an indirect warning left behind by Isaiah, but Esther had also kept completely silent about what she'd seen. Sena must have realized that she'd read it, and yet Esther was still in no hurry to leave, even though Isaiah clearly wouldn't have wanted her there. How could she ever expect Sena to prioritize a stranger over the wishes of her deceased father? A father who she'd obviously adored, and who adored her in return despite his bitter ways. Even if she felt it was wrong to keep Sena isolated, it wasn't her decision to make. And in the end, if Sena decided to follow Isaiah's wishes, Esther had no right to hold it against her. She was only honoring her father's memory, living how he'd always wanted her to. She knew that. She knew that, and yet... Yeah, well, Isaiah was a doo-doo head, so I don't care about his wishes. Esther took a long, deep breath to try to refocus. A heavy lump had formed in her throat. She had to concentrate to swallow it down, to force away the emotion rising in her chest. It was time for her to accept things and move on. She would learn a lesson from all this, and continue her life with greater wisdom to fall back on if it happened again. It would be alright. In the end, everything would be alright. After a few minutes, Esther managed to calm herself down. Once she'd managed to regain a grip on her composure, she began to search for Isaiah's treatise with even more focused intensity, pushing away the encroaching thoughts or feelings as they came to her. She deliberately ignored every journal page about his daily life, especially anything that mentioned Sena, and concentrated solely on finding something about the RFL. But as the hours passed and morning turned into afternoon, her efforts were still met with no success. It was so difficult not to let herself get exasperated. She could feel her focus waning again, and the heavy weight of the pail only worsened the sensation clouding her head. Realizing that it made more sense to take a short break than to keep pushing, Esther picked up a random stray paper and sat down on the desk with a quiet sigh. Oh, this is the right one! The writing was even messier than the previous entries, scribbled in such obvious haste that it became nearly incomprehensible. But as her eyes roamed across the page, Esther found herself getting steadily more absorbed in the disturbing writing. As if her mind was falling into step with Isaiah's own, she could decipher everything, understand it, feel it, as if she were there beside him. It's the Illuminati! I have boarded up the windows and barricaded the doors. I am too terrified to light a candle, for its glow would surely betray me in the dark. I understand now that I understand now that what I witnessed was no hallucination. No, I am not mad after all. The RFL have not forgotten me. I fled into the darkness, and I stirred those living fears from their deep sleep. Some of them took hold of me, seeped into my mind, and my body began to hasten my decay, to ruin me with a vengeance, but from the others I managed to escape. And now they are coming for me. They are waiting in the shadows, listening for my breath. I can feel the same rejection of life rising in my stomach like before. This bile of hatred for my own existence. It is their punishment. It is a premonition of what they will have me do. They will drive me to kill myself. By writing this, I am only bringing them closer to me. They are so close now. Nothing will keep them out. Nothing will save me. All I can do is run. Ugh. The quill snapped between his trembling fingers. A chilling draft had leaked through the window, boarded up and secure as he thought it was. His stomach began to slowly knot itself in pure dread. Not safe. He wasn't safe. They were almost here. Morning. Just until morning. He pushed himself up to his feet in a sudden, clumsy movement, sending his paper scattering off the desk. A small beaker of fluid fell to one side, spilling its contents onto the floor, but the man failed to notice. Morning. That was it. He could just run, flee, escape them until the morning. He could still live. Racing over to his door, he froze as his fingers brushed the doorknob. Careful. He had to be careful. He pressed his ear to the door, held his breath, and listened. Silence. It was safe. With a shuddering exhale of relief, he crept into the hallway and down the stairs. 2 large bookshelves and a chair were barricading the front door, but he only needed to remove one of the shelves to slip outside. Quickly, quietly. Before long, he had stumbled outside into the swirling mists that surrounded the manor. The frigid wind drained the color and feeling from his face, but it was a welcome numbness. Where? Where can I go? Where? No, it doesn't matter. Anywhere. Far, far away, but not here. Hey, is my phone going off? No, Idaho, I don't care. Slurred words rasped from his lips, clouded with the confusion of a man half asleep. He began to fall forward, but instead of spilling to the ground, the momentum sent his body stumbling through the grass. A lurching walk, then a jog. Faster, faster. Soon he had broken into a steady run. Running, running, walking, walking, tired. He had to get away. He had to get away from it all. But his footfalls were loud, so loud. The faster he ran, the more they heard him. They were close now, getting closer. No, he was safe. He'd be safe, stayed safe as long as he kept running. Outrun the spooky ghosties. He thought he was safe, knew he was safe, had to be safe. And he was safe until he looked behind him. Fear sliced through his skull. For a moment, everything went black. When his eyes reopened, he was running. Why? Why? He had left. He was gone. They couldn't catch him here. They couldn't follow him. No, no, he didn't want to die. He didn't want to suffer. He didn't deserve to suffer. He hadn't done anything wrong. They knew it. In that moment, the world warped and shifted. Horrible screams pierced his ears, familiar screams calling out his name, shouting, hating, weeping, screaming, the cries of all those he had hurt in his selfishness. No! No! They were in front of him, running from him as he ran now, fleeing from those who'd come to collect him. Their voices warped and twisted into shrieks, cutting through his brain like knives of penance. Please! Please! Stop! Stop it! No, please! He grabbed his head with both hands, covering his ears, but the sound only echoed louder. There is no monster here! There is no monster out there. It's only you! Ah ha ha! No! No, it can't be. Suddenly he staggered forward. All the strength in his body was gone. In an instant, he crumpled to the ground, twitching and convulsing. Move, move! His body would no longer respond. Every function gone. His brain was trapped in a husk, a casket. They had buried him alive. He would lie there and rot, watch himself rot. Hours and hours, helpless. Insects and animals eating him, every scream silent. He deserved it, his punishment. The punishment they gave him. No. The punishment he'd given himself. What? Esther suddenly gasped for air. Her lungs burned, her legs ached. Had she been running? How? How was that possible? Just a moment ago she'd been reading Isaiah's journal. How had she gotten here? Psychic connection of some sort, I guess. All of a sudden, hazy memories flooded back to her. A few minutes ago, no, hours ago, she had left Isaiah's study. Something had called out to her, a sudden, intense, overwhelming urge that she couldn't resist. A call to follow Isaiah, wasn't it? She needed to get away, to get out of the manor, away from her own thoughts. So as she tore down the stairs in a panic, nearly tripping over herself in her frantic need to flee, there was no sign of Sena as she ran across the manor grounds. She must have been in the cemetery. But Esther ran the opposite way. And now Sena gets to feel guilty for killing the only 2 people in her life. Into the forest, the same deep woods she'd come from, throwing herself carelessly forward. Had she been fleeing all this time? Impossible. When she glanced up at the sky, the sun was just past its highest point. And if that many hours had truly passed, then she'd fled a decent way from the manor. Getting back would be a difficult task, especially since she had initially found the place by sheer luck. She had no map, no compass. All she could do was try to strain her memory back several weeks prior and seek out any features she'd passed by. A ridiculous plan, certainly, but there were hardly any other options. But do you still have a piece of Isaiah's things, or else the ward will keep you out? Trying her best to keep her spirits up, Esther began wandering through the trees. She still felt slightly dazed, both from her lapse in consciousness and the events of the past 2 days. Earlier that morning, she thought she was fine. Not in the best of spirits, of course, but still prepared to make peace with it all and move on. And yet somehow her subconscious mind had grown so unsettled that she'd run away in a fugue state, something that had never happened before. Were her real feelings truly that disturbed deep down? Had she been so upset by Seina's rejection that she fled the manor in an attack of anxiety? It was frustrating and embarrassing, to say the least. She wanted to think herself as far more resilient than that. But in the end, perhaps it was much more than just a friend throwing her away. Perhaps it was confirmation of what she'd feared all along, that she was never meant to find what she truly longed for. What exactly was it she longed for, Esther couldn't say for certain. All she knew is that Seina embodied it somehow. The more Esther dwelled on that idea, the more afraid she grew of the thought of seeing the other girl again. Maybe it was better if she didn't go back. After all, the sooner she could distance herself and start to recover, the better. And of course she didn't want to hurt Seina or make things any more difficult for her. She'd already done so much for Esther, and the thought of straining her further, especially after last night, seemed unreasonable. Leaving, then, would surely be the best choice, for both of them. Seina, everyone I love leaves me! Suddenly, Esther froze. A horrible thought struck her out of nowhere, making her blood run cold. The watch. She didn't have the watch. Her medicine. With no way to tell where she was, she'd never be able to return to the road in time to call for help. But if she'd only gone a few hours from the manor, at least Esther knew she had a chance to make it back. There was no other choice. If she didn't retrieve it, she'd fall into a catatonic state as soon as her dose ran out. She had to find the manor again, and before nightfall. Otherwise, everything would be utterly for naught. New art. When Esther began to walk again, her steps grew much more hurried. Nothing looked familiar, and yet somehow she still wondered if she hadn't seen it all before. She thought she remembered finding the manor in the east, in the opposite direction of the setting sun, but in the back of her mind she was starting to doubt if her own memory could truly be trusted any longer. Once more, Esther found herself completely lost in these vast, lonely woods. This time she didn't even have her meager supplies with her, nor the comfort of knowing she could survive the night. In a way, she felt like she was trapped in a loop, reliving a twisted, more fateful version of her earlier journey. Afraid of finding the manor, even more terrified of not finding it, doing her best to believe that everything would be alright. The art of this game is really nice. I gotta say, I love the painted aesthetic, and the character portraits are really nice. And that's something you can really do with a small budget game. Is if you keep things in a small scope, you can put a lot more detail into them. That's something to keep in mind. As the evening steadily crept closer, Esther encountered a little stream running along her path. Also, those sound effects. There's good use of sound effects in this. Lots of good footsteps, lots of according to what type of terrain they're on, like the squeaky floorboards of the upper floor of the manor, or the slightly more sturdy ones of the lower floor, the crunch of the grass, but the soft swishing of the tamed grass around the manor grounds, the clonking of footsteps in the mausoleum, things like that, shuffling through papers. It's little things that you don't directly notice if you're not looking for them, but it's something that really does add to a visual novel. Because, basically, why make a visual novel when you can just write a book, right? Well, a visual novel is also an audio novel. Even if you don't have voice acting, you can add sound effects to enhance the scene. And of course, having images that can play out dynamically according to what text is being displayed also adds a lot. And that way a book can become more alive. You can add a lot more, and you can set scenes without having 10-page descriptions of what the grass looked like, that a lot of people take umbrage with in a lot of classic literature, myself included. You don't have to describe what the grass looks like, you can just show it. And that really is showing without telling, At first her heart leapt, but then a flash of fear overtook her brief hope. Was it really the same stream she'd played in with Sena? Or could it be a different one altogether? She didn't remember anything familiar about this spot, but maybe if she followed it along she'd encounter something else. The stream had flowed to the right of where they stood on its bank. Or had it? With a sense of growing, empty dread slowly building in her chest, Esther realized just how shapeless her memories and thoughts had become. Perhaps that is why everything seemed the same, yet completely different, with no solid reality of what she could tether herself to. And at any moment, a dream could become a nightmare. And then she woke up in bed. Ba-da-ba-ba-da. And Sena's probably looking for her. Night had fallen. It arrived far, far too quickly, cloaking the forest in thick darkness that made it even more deeply confusing. She'd been running for a while now. Her eyes darted around, trying to desperately glean any memories or points of interest that stirred her mind. Yeah, and at this point, Sena's like, oh god, not again. They left me again. It's night. She's gonna die. It's all my fault. I'm gonna be alone again. So away to go, Esther. But nothing ever appeared. The stillness that surrounded her suddenly felt eerie beyond compare. She could hear the rustling of leaves, the crickets, the nocturnal creatures that skittered after prey or fled from predators. But she never saw them. Nothing moved. Everything looked the same, like a painting, an image frozen in time, never changing. As if she kept going down the same path over and over again. Esther's like, this level design sucks. As Esther dashed into another cluster of dark trees, a horrible, petrifying realization flashed before her. Isaiah's key. She had given it to Sena. With the warding charm that protected the manor, that meant... No. No, please no. She wouldn't be able to go back. There was nothing. She had nothing of Isaiah's. No way to regain entry after leaving the protected space. How far did the wood's perimeter even reach? Was she only a few minutes away from the manor, or miles? It didn't matter. She had no hope of reaching the road, even if she'd known where it was. No way of returning to the manor, except if she encountered Sena. But Esther had been gone all day. Surely Sena would have noticed her disappearance by now. If she'd been searching for Esther, they would have encountered each other after so many hours. Esther hadn't even strayed that far. Had she? No, she hadn't. She turned around and gone back the way she came. But what if she'd been running back towards the manor when she awoke? Desperately, frantically trying to get back, trying to find a way back in. And all this time she'd only been walking in hopeless circles, never getting closer or further away. Only the trees shifting while she remained in place. As she tried to curl her arms around herself for warmth, they seemed heavier than before, like they were being steadily filled with lead. Her flesh was still sensitive, but her muscles no longer responded like they usually did. A feeling as if they were trying to move a puppet with fraying strings. It was past the time for her dose. She broke into a sprint. Every step grew more impossible than the last, and her body threatened to collapse from the strain at any moment. It was as horrifying as the doctor's warnings. No, worse, for nothing could describe the sense of uncontrol slipping away. Yuck! Stumbling forward, she barely managed to catch her balance, holding onto a tree for support as her legs seemed on the verge of giving away. No. I won't let it. Her fingernails dug desperately into the crumbling bark. She couldn't let go. If she did, there'd be no getting back up again. She had to keep going. She had to keep looking. To fail like this. A loud thought occurred to her. The blood through her ears growing, deafening her, drowning out everything else. Who was she really holding on for? Ah! At last her body could no longer support itself. She collapsed to the ground, whimpering, trying to push herself up again. But after one last desperate strain of her arms and legs, she fell still. Even her eyes refused to move. I'm in here, trapped like a casket! My own punishment! I detonated my soul! Her gaze remained frozen, staring in terror up at the sky, no longer able to see what was going on around her. Panic flooded her entire system, making the world spin and turning her thoughts into fragments of fear. Suddenly she understood. She would die like Isaiah. Alone, frozen in horror, feeling the cold grip of death squeezing her lungs, rotting while still breathing, forced to remain conscious as every faculty in her body broke down, praying for it all to end. Please end. That's what I was saying to the game yesterday. Please, make it stop. I said that too. Please, 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 please. Pliats. Plus. Plox. A distant cry echoed through her head. Something far away in the dark, shifting among the unmoving trees. Maybe it was coming for her. Maybe it had been waiting for her to fall helpless. Again, the sound cried out, closer this time. It was familiar somehow, like a dream. Like awakening from a dream. Esther! 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 Esther, please! That voice. It belonged to Sena. She could hear her footsteps in the distance, running, getting neither closer nor further away. If only she could call out to her. But she couldn't. She was completely, totally helpless. Sena would pass her by, and forever believe that Esther had abandoned her. Had Isaiah endured this too? Had he heard his daughter calling out for him, running past just out of sight? Unable to cry, unable to scream, unable to reach out for help. Unable to do anything but wait. Esther! Esther, are you out there? She was so close. Soon she would pass by. Esther! Esther, please, please answer me! But instead of fading into the distance, the voice grew even closer. Closer, closer, closer. Until... Esther! Oh no! A figure crashed to the ground beside her. Warm hands grasped her shoulders, then frantically pressed over her heart. Oh, Esther, you're still breathing. I'm so glad. I'm so glad too. Oh no. You can't move. Oh no. Your medicine, you don't have it. But there's no time. I can't risk running back for the watch. She heard Sena inhaling a trembling breath, desperately trying to calm herself. Then, thin, wiry arms began to cradle her body, lifting her slowly upwards. Yeah! I can do it! I can... At first, Sena staggered to her feet, as if her small figure couldn't handle Esther's weight. But then as soon as she caught her balance, stumbling forward a few steps, she slowly began to run. I'll bring you back. I got a shit. I'll be back in a minute. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Hope you've been enjoying the scene. I let my cat in to do streaming for me, but he didn't even advance one screen. Hold on, Esther. I promise you'll be alright. Her head rested against Seina's shoulder. It felt so warm, so comforting. Seina had come to save her. Seina is shredded, by the way. Princess carrying someone who is heavier than her. That was the only thing Esther could bring herself to care about. Whether or not they made it back to the manor in time. Incidentally, the best way to carry someone, especially if they're, like, really heavy, is to, like, sling them over your back, so that essentially what's carrying them is less your arm muscles and more, like, your skeleton. Your skeleton is just being pushed down, and therefore pushing back up on the person to keep them aloft. Like, that's probably real bad for your back eventually, but it does allow you to carry really heavy things. It's called a fireman's carry, because, you know, firemen use it. Whether or not they made it back to the manor in time, it didn't really matter anymore. The smaller girl grasped and panted with effort, but her pace never slowed. Her footsteps raced through the forest, so strong and so determined, never straying from their goal. She saw things Esther couldn't see. The hidden paths, the different trees, the stars that mapped the true direction. And for her, Isaiah's words relented. There were no circles, only a straight and unwavering line. Through the final trees towards the clearing, into the mist that had once warned her away, into the manor that she tried to escape from. Finally. After dashing up the stairs with Esther still in her arms, Seina ran into the bedroom. As soon as she'd set the taller girl onto the bedsheet, she grabbed Esther's watch from the nightstand, frantically grasping for its switch. But do you know how to operate it? Here. Your arm, the medicine. She pushed up Esther's sleeve, though her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold the watch. With a deep breath, Seina steadied herself and pushed the needle into Esther's arm. The usual moment of relief never arrived, only the sudden wave of nausea. But slowly, steadily, a trace of energy began returning to her muscles. Yeah. She squeezed her eyes shut and reopened them, blinking to try and relieve the raw burning sensation. Death had grazed her so closely that she could feel it, an icy cloud still hovering across her skin. Esther? Is it working? Esther, please. Yes. Forcing out the word in a choked, hoarse voice, she tried to offer Seina a faint smile. Faina a faint smile. Thank you. Meow. Esther. You're alright. You're alright. The tears she'd been barely holding back suddenly began overflowing. Sobbing, Seina threw her arms around Esther, burying her face against the other girl's neck. As more of her strength gradually returned, she was able to drape her own arms around Seina. The intense shock made it difficult, if not impossible, for her to truly form any thoughts. All she could feel was an immense, overwhelming relief, a deep gratitude for every breath she took. I'm so sorry. So sorry. I don't want you to go. I never wanted you to go. Seina's tearful whimpers were soft and muddled. Esther could feel warm tears falling against her shoulder and the trembling exhales that followed each sob. I was just so sad, thinking of Papa. But I don't want you to leave, Esther. Please don't. Please don't leave me. I won't. I promise I won't. Murmuring gently, she gave a tight squeeze of her arms around Seina, hoping to reassure her. There's still so much we have to do together, isn't there? Games, picnics, recipes, reading, exploring. I couldn't leave you all before that. Unless you read another of Isaiah's journals and go on a brain journey with him to the forest. She embraced her, wiped her tears, and hushed her gently, cradling her smaller friend against her chest. But nothing she did or said seemed to comfort Seina. Her whole body kept shaking like a leaf, suddenly fragile and on the cusp of breaking. Esther was almost afraid to touch her. Still, she gingerly stroked her fingers through the soft blonde hair, holding her as she let out everything she'd built up inside. Not just from that night, but ever since her father disappeared. No one had held her. No one had comforted her. No one had told her that everything would be alright, no matter how much it hurt at that moment. Esther desperately wished she could do more, that she could travel back in time to be there for Sena when nobody else was. Also, you wanna tell her how her father probably died, that he ran away like she just did, and collapsed under exhaustion, and when Sena went out into the woods for 3 days to look for him, she probably just never found him because the colors he wore were too muddled, and therefore he blended in, and so she couldn't find him, and he wasn't able to say anything in response. No, you probably don't want to tell her that. She'd feel worse. At the very least, she could be here now. She could promise not to hurt her friend ever again. At last, Sena's trembling sobs and uneven breathing began to subside. From the way her chest rhythmically rose and fell and her body limply rested against Esther's, she knew Sena had fallen asleep. Running all the way home while carrying Esther must have left her exhausted. If not for her surge of fear and determination, there was no way she would have been able to lift a girl Esther's size for so long. And yet somehow, Sena had managed to save her. She got that mama bear adrenaline. Let's, famously, like, mothers lift cars that are on their babies. And it's real bad for your muscles. There's a reason we can't normally do that. You know, the saying, the thought that, oh, we only use 10% of our brains is nonsense. But we kind of only use, I mean, maybe not 10%, but like a small percentage of our muscles. Because if we used them all, if we essentially overclocked them, they would just rip themselves apart. Human muscles, or really any animal muscles, are really strong. But, yeah, they can't keep up that strength for very long. A crushing sense of guilt sank down into her stomach. If only she'd been more careful with her medicine. If she hadn't let herself get so distraught and irrational. She never would have caused Sena this kind of pain and worry. Esther never would have caused her this pain and worry. I should run away. She doesn't need me. She deserves better. Esther had forced her to relive the night Isaiah disappeared, struck by the same fear and despair of being abandoned. And she too had been so close to meeting Isaiah's same fate. If Sena hadn't found her at the last moment. Swallowing hard to hold back her tears, Esther gently detached from Sena to pull herself up. She was too exhausted to change into her nightclothes, but she could at least put both of them under the covers. Pulling the fluffy comforter up to the smaller girl's shoulders, she tucked her in tightly, which seemed to lessen Sena's trembling somewhat. In a way, she almost felt too guilty to hold her again. After hurting her so badly, did she really deserve to comfort Sena, to share her presence? You are falling into the same trap that led you here, Esther. Stop it! No, Sena wanted her there. She still had to remind herself of that, even after everything had happened. Guilt, doubt, shame, none of it mattered anymore. Sena had already made it clear how much she cared about Esther, and doubting her would be the same as rejecting her. Back in the forest, lying there in the darkness, she had given in to her fear of abandonment. But that was a mistake she refused to ever repeat. From now on, no matter what happened, she would trust Sena. Her kind, dear, selfless companion. She would never let her down again. And somehow she'd find a way to repay her. Good night, Sena. Sweet dreams. Whispering softly, she pressed a small kiss against the top of Sena's head. In response, the other girl made a soft sound in between a whimper and a sigh, curling up to Esther's side. And when she closed her eyes, Esther felt a powerful exhaustion sweep over her, greater than perhaps any night before. Endless thoughts kept circling in her head, dreadful memories and ghosts of the fears she'd had while paralyzed, facing her death. But the warm presence nestled up against her, fragile and vulnerable, and yet so strong and incredibly willful, soothed Esther's frayed nerves. Before long, she was slipping into a deep and dreamless sleep, completely removed from all the cares in the world, yet still holding on to her dearest companion, who held her tightly in return. And then a nightmare! Ba-da-ba-ba-da. Stray leaves floated down the stream, slowly disappearing into darkness. He watched them pass by with a certain strange melancholy. The idea of leaving behind his research, those countless hours of experiments and writing, no longer bothered him. But moments like these, now that he was faced with losing them forever, the simplest pleasures of life suddenly seemed invaluable. Every morning in the garden, every thunderstorm on a spring day, every cup of tea and conversation at the table, every night clear enough to admire the constellations. He had wished he had appreciated them more. Up until now, he hadn't realized how much they meant to him, how many little joys he'd had never bothered savoring. If only he could have recognized it all earlier. So many things never showed their value until they were gone. Brrr. His thin, trembling fingers brushed across the top of Sena's head. She was fast asleep, lying contentedly in his lap. He'd given her an astronomical lecture that night, but despite her best efforts to stay awake, she'd finally dozed off halfway through. You certainly worked hard today, didn't you? I suppose you did inherit my ways after all. He murmured affectionately, unable to contain a smile, painful as it was. This was the last time they'd ever spend time together. He'd realized it earlier, but he forced himself to act as normal and unaffected as possible during their walk, despite the anguish he felt whenever he remembered. How quickly all these years had gone by. He had never imagined it would end like this. It was only a kiss. Since his escape from the mausoleum that fateful night, dark irrational feelings had begun creeping into the edges of his mind, growing stronger day by day. Fear and resentment with little substance behind them, distorted images of both himself and Sena, twisting them both into reprehensible monsters. It was the same bitterness he'd felt so long ago, back when they'd first moved here together. Sena became the personification of all of his misfortune and woe, a symbol of life's mockery instead of his beloved irreplaceable daughter. He slipped into such thoughts without realizing it, and only in the middle of that bleak, hateful fog he would suddenly become himself again. Suffocated by his growing paranoia and anxiety, these lucid moments were steadily withering away. Now he had to shut himself in his study most of the day, never knowing when a wave of delusions would seize him. No longer could he freely spend his days working with Sena, for he constantly feared what those venomous shadows would make him say to her. Their whispers had become so frequent that soon he knew that they would overtake his mind completely. But tonight, summoning the last of his strength, he had offered to take her on a walk by that stream, determined to spend one last quiet evening together. How overjoyed she had been. She believed he was finally getting better again, and soon life would return to how it once was. Was it crueler to lie to her, or to tell her that he was dying? He kept agonizing over the decision, which seemed to have no right answer. I'll tell her tomorrow, he always thought. But whenever a new morning arrived and she was so thrilled to see him outside of his room again, his will kept faltering. Anyway, let's get boarding up the windows. Gotta keep the ghosts out! He wished could have seen her grow up. She already resembled her mother so much. No doubt she'd be her spitting image as an adult. In the clear part of his mind, he no longer felt bitterly towards Amaranthe. Even if she rejected the life of a mother, and even if her disappearance had led him to such despair, she had still given him Sena. Somehow, somewhere, he hoped she could find happiness. She deserved a life better than whatever he could have offered, just like Sena did. Moving slowly to avoid disturbing her, Isaiah rose to his feet, holding Sena closely against his chest. In a way, he was relieved she had fallen asleep. He didn't think he could bear bidding good night to her, knowing it would be the final time. But goodbyes were for the benefit of the living, not the dead. The memory would soon be hers, and only hers. Even knowing that he still couldn't bring himself to disturb her peaceful rest. Perhaps she would forgive him with this one last selfish act. Turning towards the manor, he began his journey home with slow, lingering steps. He could sense a storm gradually approaching. Heavy rain was on its way, the type that would blanket the manor for a long, gloomy day. But once the storm lifted, the fragile blooms of spring would flourish in its wake. Over and over again, year after year. No matter what befell them, they would always come back. Ah! A soft clatter, followed by an even softer gasp, stirred Esther from the edge of sleep. As her eyes slowly stirred open, she saw a blurry figure standing beside the bed, fiddling with something on the nightstand. After blinking a few times, she was able to make out Seina's face, a pair of bright eyes flicking towards her sheepishly, matched by an embarrassed smile. Ah, I woke you up after all. And after I tried so hard to be quiet. Oh well, it can't be helped, I suppose. It's fine. I should get up anyway. Yeah! But as she struggled to lift herself upright, Esther found she could barely move without immense, overwhelming effort. Oddly enough, it seemed different from her typical mornings of lethargy. Instead, she had the same feeling she'd had after her first day of work with Seina, a deep exhaustion from straining herself so much in ways she wasn't used to. It was a much stronger sensation, but not unpleasant. It felt almost cathartic instead, like the satisfaction of pushing to one's limits. I don't think I can agree with you on that one, Esther. What you should do is rest. Real rest, not work disguised as rest. Shouldn't you be the one resting? After everything you did last night. Ah. A faint blush rose to Seina's cheeks. Her gaze fell somberly on the floor and she seemed unable to reply for several moments, clenching the hem of her dress between her fingers. I rested plenty. Don't worry about me, please. Something about her reassuring words sounded almost pleading, as if the last thing she wanted was for Esther to be concerned. Her words sounded pleading, as if she had said please. Sitting down on the bedspread, Seina sighed quietly. The tension had broken between them, but it was impossible to ignore the difficult, unspoken questions that were left behind. I'm sorry, Esther, for everything. What I said last night about not leaving me. I know you need to go home. If Papa was here, he'd probably be really happy about that idea too. And I know I can't go with you because this is my world. Maybe one day I could travel somewhere else, but I can't. Not just yet. The manor, the grounds, the forest. Taking care of this place is the only way I have to keep Papa's memory alive. If I abandoned it now, I'd never be able to forgive myself. I'd feel haunted forever. But I'm selfish. I don't want you to go because I'll miss you. I'll miss you so much, Esther. I can't even tell you how I felt when I thought you'd left me. She put on a small, self-deprecating smile as she spoke, each word sounding as heavy as lead. Seina's confession brought more sadness than it did joy. The one-sided pain of separation was something she could deal with, but knowing that Seina would miss her just as much, that seemed far more unbearable. Turning her head slowly away from Seina, she gazed out through the window into the radiant sunlight that glimmered more brightly with each passing moment. This place. It feels like another home to me. Even if it's only been a few weeks, I would never forget the time I spent here. It's probably silly, and I don't really understand why, but working together, playing together, reading together, I think these moments were the happiest ones I've ever had. I could always be myself around you, Seina. You don't know how happy that made me. And when I think about going back to a world where I have to act like everyone else, I wish I could pretend it didn't exist. But you're right. You know, this feels like the game is coming to a close without addressing the spooky ghosties that much. Just like, and then they lived for, a while. Not happily ever after, because, Esther died in a few months. But, I mean, happily. I can't stay here forever. Her eyes slowly drifted back towards Seina. My medicine will run out soon. If there's no real cure for the Pale, then I have to return to the city, to my family. I promised them. As Seina studied her in silence, her posture drooped slightly like a wilting flower deprived of water or light. The somber, lonely weight in her expression drew Esther's mind back to that night by the pond when Seina had spoken of her father's decline. Esther, when you leave. She lowered her head slightly, biting her lip. Would you ever come back? Of course I would. I don't know when, but... Then I'll wait for you. Seina's quiet reply interrupted her. She looked up to see the other girl gazing at her with fierce determination. No matter how long you're gone, I really, really, really wait for you. I promise. Even if we're apart for years and years, I'll always be here to welcome you back. I don't care how long it takes, or how different you might be, or if you only walked by to wave at me before moving on. As long as I know I'll see you again someday. That's all that matters. She didn't understand why, but beyond any shadow of doubt, she knew they would meet again. It's a promise, then. I'll come back. If you don't, I'll be really cross with you. If you die, I'll be super upset. Really, really. Leaning forward, Esther curled her arms around the smaller girl, pulling her into a gentle hug. Sena snuggled tightly against her, the faint warmth of her teardrops soaking into Esther's blouse. For a long, long time, they held each other in silence. It felt solemn and bittersweet, as if they were already saying farewell, even though it would surely be a while longer before Esther left. But in that moment, they finally understood each other. Their promise was sealed, forever set in stone by their shared determined belief in it. A belief that would never, ever waver, no matter what. Never, ever, forever, never. Getting a lot of repeated adverbs now, like never, ever, and very, very, and long, long. We ran out. The thesaurus has been sucked dry of adjectives. Not until the very end of time. Finally, they pulled away slightly before sitting before one another, clasping each other's hands. Something seemed different about Sena. There was a deep resolve in her eyes, hidden behind the gentle way she gazed at Esther. I have a silly question for you, Esther. If you were cured of the Pale, what's the first thing you think you'd do? Break my watch, I think. It stabbed me one too many times. After a short pause, Sena giggled softly, shaking her head. I can understand that. I know it's a funny thing to ask. I was just curious. For whatever reason, Esther's reply seemed to have made her happy. Well, I think you ought to eat a bit of breakfast, then get some more sleep. I left your favorites on the nightstand. The tea's probably gotten cold by now, though. I think I'll survive. I hope so. You deserve better than to perish from cold tea, really. If you need me, I'll be out in the garden, or downstairs, but I'll see you later, alright? She nodded. No matter how little time they had left together, it still brought her such relief to have things back to normal. Once Sena had hopped off the bed and left the room with a cheery wave, Esther pulled over a tray of breakfast. She hadn't realized it until now, but she was ravenously hungry, so much that her stomach actually hurt a little when she began to eat. Afterwards, a sense of drowsy contentment settled over her, drawing her towards the tempting arms of sleep. I get that. We call, in my household, we call that the itis. When you sleep, when you eat a whole bunch and then you're really sleepy, that's the itis. She yearned to go outside and work with Sena, not wanting to waste her remaining time in the forest, but her body still felt so weak. Without more rest, she likely wouldn't even be able to get downstairs. Reluctantly, she curled back beneath the bed sheets, turning away from the bright sunlight. Just a short rest. That was all she needed. Afterwards, she'd go back to the study and try to search through the remaining papers. Perhaps there was still something left. One last secret for her to uncover. Anyway, then she ran away again in delirium. So dark. When her eyelids slowly struggled open, it felt like her whole head was in a fog. She could glimpse a trace of moonlight from the window. Had she really slept through the whole day? Her body must have been even weaker than she thought it was. Slowly, Esther attempted to pull herself up to her feet. Her legs were still a little unsteady, but she felt far better than she had before. Sena was probably waiting for her downstairs. Perhaps Esther could still make it in time to help her friend with dinner. Just as she was about to make her way towards the bedroom door, something strange suddenly caught Esther's eye. Nightmare time! A pile of papers resting on the nightstand. They hadn't been there before. At first, she thought it might have been something Santa wrote, but when she looked more closely at the scribbled handwriting, she'd been keeping secrets! These pages. They were the missing parts of Isaiah's treatise on the Arafel. When had Santa found them? Her confusion and shock were soon consumed by a desperate curiosity. After hastily lighting a candle, she leaned over the nightstand and began to read. A new, willing host. The environment must also be suitable. In this case, an area that attracts a large number of Arafel due to the concentrated essences of either the living or the dead. If the current sufferer and another unafflicted human are brought together in such a place, and the new host accepts the entirety of the sufferer's burden onto themselves, the pale will lift, and all the Arafel will be drawn to the emotional energy within the new host's body. The effects of the transfer are impossible to fully predict, but in the majority of cases, the host will no longer be able to function. There is only one other cure that I can ascertain for this mysterious restless ailment. I will refer to it as the ascension of the afflicted, the progress of their body into something that can live in harmony with the Arafel. This has occurred with breathtaking rarity, yet for those who did ascend, they were destined to become unforgettable and beloved figures in all ages to come. To the best of my knowledge, there is no singular way for ascension to occur. In fact, the ways are infinite. That is precisely why the method is nigh unachievable, for we cannot possibly say what defines it. For some, it was a sudden flash of clarity beyond the fabric of our universe. For others, it struck them after endless meditation, study, and pilgrimages of both mind and body. And for a select few, it came from only long, fathomless, inescapable solitude. We humans have not yet evolved the stage of consciously achieving such a cure, and for now it remains beyond our realm of comprehension. Indeed, perhaps the Arafel were never meant to be understood by us. If that is the case, then no amount of scientific research will ever obtain a true cure for the pale. However, I believe a singularity lies at the end of their arcane primordial path. All those who have learned to walk hand in hand with these spirits speak of a final destination, a last door, an end that leads into a new beginning. A place the Arafel would lead us all, but in our weakness we mistake their guidance for twisted malice. What lies at the end of that path, the languages of speech, art, and mathematics will never reveal. For ultimately it spans beyond the thoughts and knowledges our limited minds may yet contain. All we can surmise is that there, and only there, at the threshold of this mortal world and all the unseen dimensions beyond it, the pale Cachexia becomes a gateway of transformation for the very soul itself. Yeah, I was right about the sacrifice. Transferring the pale, or ascending. Both seemed virtually impossible, albeit for different reasons. Was that really all he had written, the only possible cures? If so, then... To her surprise, there was another piece of paper attached to Isaiah's writings. The ink still looked fresh, a note from Sena. An ominous presence welled in her chest. Esther tried to force it back, but as she held up Sena's note to the candlelight, her hands began to shake slightly. You want to do the transfer? Let's go, buddy! Dear Esther, I hope you can forgive me. A few days ago I found these papers, and I've been hiding them in my wardrobe ever since. I was afraid you'd leave as soon as you found them, but even more than that, I felt so guilty. Guilty for being too afraid to help you. Guilty for knowing what Papa would think, too. Until last night, I never realized how important you were to me until you left. When I found you lying on the forest and I thought you were dead, you looked like a corpse even though you were still breathing. I don't want to see you like that ever again. I think I'd go insane if I did. So I've made up my mind. I promised that I'd help you no matter what. And if Papa was right, if the Arafel truly are real, then I can help you after all. You deserve happiness, Esther. You have people back in the city waiting for you, and once you're cured, you'll be able to live a normal life again. And I'm not afraid anymore. If there's a chance I could cure you forever, I'll do anything. Anything at all. When you're ready, come meet me in the place we promised to go together. I don't know what will happen, or if it will even work, but I want to try. Please don't be too angry with me. I only want to make you happy. Human sacrifice! Human sacrifice! The note fell from her fingers. For a moment, she stood there completely stunned, at a loss for how to process everything and respond. Did she want to transfer the illness to herself? Impossible. Esther would never agree to such a thing. But what if she was already in the mausoleum? The Arafel. They were down there. From Isaiah's writings and her own dreams, she knew they were there. If they latched onto Sena the same way they had to her father, was she already lying down there, alone in the dark, paralyzed? There was no other choice. She had to go down there, down into the mausoleum. She had to stop her friend's attempt to cure her. Sena's life was a trade she would never, ever accept. Sena dashed down the stairs so quickly her feet barely touched the floor. Within a few moments she was outside, racing across the manor grounds in a frantic sprint. She didn't even feel the sting of exertion in her lungs, nor the impact on her legs. She couldn't feel anything at all, only a sinking, helpless fear. Why? Why was Sena doing this? She must have known that Esther never would have willingly agreed to it. But why would she risk her own life and happiness? Didn't she realize how devastated Esther would be if anything happened to her? It was so rash, so naive, such a horribly reckless thing to do. And what would happen if it actually worked? You would get to live with the ultimate survivor's guilt! A few minutes later, she dashed into the graveyard, pushing through the underbrush in desperate panic. There, facing her from across the cemetery, the mausoleum door stood open, waiting. But instead of calling out to her with that same golden glow from her dream, she felt a primal sense of revulsion and fear, as if every bone in her body was begging for her to turn away. As she approached the gaping stone maw, dread crept through her with a sickening chill. It took the entirety of her willpower to force her body forwards, each step more difficult than the last. When she finally crossed the threshold and her uneven paces echoed coldly around her, she wondered if she would ever make it back again. At the bottom of those long, winding stairs, the crypt opened up beyond her. It looked identical to the one Esther had seen in her dream, only colder and more oppressive, lacking any of the strange sense of comfort she'd felt. There! Sena. She sounded so frail, but she was terrified. Terrified of what might hear her. Terrified of what she might be, of what she might be waiting around the... Well, I think that's the first typo. Terrified of what she might be waiting around the corner. Just of what might be waiting around the corner. Or what she might see waiting around the corner, right? Either of those would work. But they combine them. Whoopsie. Accidents happen. Yes, Mr. Developer-san, I found a small typo. You should fix it. Otherwise you get 0 out of 10. Summoning all of her courage, Esther began to walk down the long, dark corridor. Past rows and rows of tombs, opened and unopened, separated by the tall structures that watched over them. She paid no attention to her path, where she'd come from, or how she'd make her way out again. All she could think about was how Sena would be when she found her. Alive? Dead? Infected? In the note, she'd said Esther had looked like a corpse. Would she have to see Sena like that too? And he did look pretty corpsey. Bleh! As she rounded the next corner, her foot suddenly hit something. When she hesitantly bent down to pick it up, her fingers brushed against a dusty, soft material. A stuffed white toy. A cat? What was it doing here? Surely it must have been Sena's. Perhaps it was a sign that she was getting close. Clinging desperately to that hope, she broke into a sprint. Oh, music cuddingly abruptly stopped. One last chance. Turn back! When those unbidden words rose into her head, Esther forced them away. She wouldn't turn back. No matter what, she would never turn back. If they were truly in her head, then they would understand why. At last, she came to a sudden halt. There, curled up on the ground beside a casket, she fell to her knees. Esther? You finally came. Her eyes slowly opened and she gave Esther a small gentle smile. Me. As she reached out for Sena with a trembling hand, Esther felt something right behind her. Suddenly, it felt like she was floating. as if an indescribable weight had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving her body light as a feather. The constant strain on her muscles was gone. The burden on her voice, the heaviness in her chest vanished altogether. She remembered this feeling. She had been so young then, always so happy. And her eyes are green. Slowly, the dark, cold walls and floors around her dissolved into nothingness. Sena! Sena, please! As she shook the other girl in her arms, staring at her face in slowly dawning terror, she realized that Sena wasn't truly unconscious. She had simply gone limp, resting in Sena's arms with eerie stillness, like a rag doll. I see that Squeedo again. It's just out of my reach. I see it. Plotting. Plotting for... these nuts! Get it! Yeah, I got him. Her features were composed in a calm, nearly blank expression, like a funeral mask, beautiful and reserved. But the faintest trace of a smile still lingered on her lips. Underneath her eyelids, not fully closed, Esther could see a glimmer of gray. No. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. You can't have it. I won't let you have it. I won't. Sena. Sena! Her anguished, frustrated screams echoed all around them, but Sena showed no response. Please. Please take me instead. I'll give you all of it. Everything. Everything I have. Just let Sena go. Don't make her suffer. I won't let her suffer. I won't. I won't. I won't let you, Sena. I won't. She repeated those words over and over again, begging and pleading in between soft, hoarse sobs. She didn't want to be cured like this. She would rather live with the pail forever. She would live with it forever. If only they would bring Sena back. And then, an enormous darkness crashed down over her. Powerful, suffocating, pushing her down, 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 far past the depths of consciousness. She could feel herself sinking, detaching from her body, from her very soul. Becoming nothing more than a thought, a tiny fragment of existence, floating away from the world, from any sense of herself. At first it terrified her. Was she dying or already dead? Would she be trapped forever in this state of nothingness? But slowly her fears began to wane. In a moment, or perhaps an eternity, she realized she wasn't being destroyed at all. She was being separated, taken apart like a broken watch, hoping to be put together again someday. Dissolved into her essential parts, the indivisible atoms of consciousness, so that she could be remade. Perhaps it was the RFL who were unraveling her, deconstructing her as a reward for her complete surrender. Strangely enough, she trusted them. She knew somehow that they were taking her somewhere very, very important, very, 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 very. It brought her such relief that she wished she could cry. Without a body, she had nothing to shed her tears with. Got a bit of a frog in my throat. I got a very in my throat. At last, just before her awareness of everything vanished completely, she felt happy. Happy and yet lonely. Strangely lonely. Alone for a... Come on. Come on. Very, 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 very long time. But perhaps that was all right. You know, I had a chat with someone who said that the adjective and adverb usage was, bad. It was too much. But at least they didn't rely on things like very or a lot. Well, don't worry. I got your varies right here. I got your very berry crunch. There was so much to do today. Planting, weeding, cleaning, researching, cooking. The list of chores always seemed to grow more daunting around this time of year. It made sense, after all. Spring was the season where everything had to be set in motion for the upcoming months. But despite the daunting prospect of such preparation, something about the cool, light breeze felt so reinvigorating. It seemed to promise a fresh start. A chance for something new and exciting right around the next corner. Leaving all the ills and mistakes of the past behind, taking the knowledge from old failures to create something new, something that would flourish in the fertile soil left behind. She became a witch and took care of her doll. Become the weird hermit in the forest taking care of the sleeping girl. No matter how jaded and cynical one grew, it was impossible not to look on with just a little hope, clinging to the tiniest chance that this time things would be different, and something beautiful would finally bear fruit. Is it going to show her, like, 50 years later? That's not 50 years later. Papa! Stirred from his thoughts, he glanced down to the small figure walking beside him. She'd been tugging his arm gently to get his attention, but he hadn't noticed up until now. Could I ask you something, Papa, please? Yes, unless it's about your biology lessons. I won't allow you to weasel your way out of completing that last chapter like you managed to yesterday. No, I'll finish it today, I promise. But I wanted to ask about something else. Go ahead, then. Sena fell unusually silent, her gaze drifting down to the forest floor. Such behavior from her was so rare that Isaiah's brows arched in uncertain anticipation. Papa, will I ever have a friend someday? A friend? She nodded shyly, hesitating for a few moments before continuing. I love you, Papa. You know I really, really do, but I wish I had a friend, someone else like me. I would even die for them, you know. No friends. All the storybook people have such lovely friends. They go on adventures, they have long talks, and cheer each other up when they're sad. It makes me so lonely when I read about them. This was not a discussion he particularly wanted to have. He had talked about this with her many, many times already. You're killing me! Strangers would never bring anything good or fruitful into her life. The temporary excitement would always fade, and eventually the troubles and turmoil would remain in its wake. He was about to sternly remind Sena of such a thing before she got any more fanciful ideas about adventures and shallow conversations. But when he looked down at her face and saw a soft, familiar wistfulness gazing back at him in her eyes, something fractured in his heart. Finally, with a long sigh of defeat, he halted mid-stride and turned to face her. Sena eagerly peered back up at him, hugging her stuffed cat against her chest while she waited for his reply. If you should ever have a friend, you ought to love them like your life depends on it. Friendship is not something to be taken lightly. You cannot befriend anyone just because they treat you nicely, or perform a few paltry favors for you here and there. How many of his own friendships had been built on such things? Most of them, surely. That's why they had all eventually frayed and fallen apart. Except for Jeremiah. Don't you redbox at me! I see you dropping kilobytes per second. You get back up into the green. You get back up into the green. Alright. Okay, we're in the green. Sometimes that man could listen so quietly and patiently. Isaiah wondered if he wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Friendship, love, means trusting someone fully, treasuring them, trying to understand them. Caring for their happiness like you care for your own, if not more so. You must believe in them, believe in the best of them, always, and they must offer you the same support, as far as you both can carry each other. It is a hard, heavy responsibility to bear on one's shoulders, Sena. If two people do not share it equally, one will be crushed beneath its weight. She somberly nodded. It seemed like she was intently absorbing his every word, committing it deeply into her memory. With a true friend, you share each other's sorrow and delight, and when one of you falls, the other is there to help them back to their feet. No sacrifice is too great. A friend's pain, a friend's life, becomes an extension of one's own. And only when the depth of that selfless loyalty is returned, when it is truly mutual to the bottom of the soul. Then and only then are two people joined in a way that can never be broken. Do you understand, Sena? I do, Papa. Sena nodded again, her features clouded by an unusually somber expression. She had been asking about this subject quite frequently as of late. He'd need to have a proper, serious conversation with her soon, a lecture about how the isolation was for her own good, and how any relationship in the real world would never match the perfect bond seen in fiction. But right now he couldn't bring himself to say anything more. He knew that pressing it further would hurt her feelings at the very least, and most likely result in some kind of quarrel. Certainly not the type of thing he wanted to ruin a perfectly peaceful spring morning with. That is all I will say on this subject for the moment. You'd be wise to ruminate on my words before we speak of it again. Reaching out, he grasped her tiny hand firmly in his own. She stayed contemplatively silent, but still offered him a small, affectionate smile. Smile bot 9000 smiles again. Together they set out once more, their footsteps lightly crunching in the grass. For some reason, a strange sadness now weighed down Isaiah's heart. Despite himself, he couldn't help but envision Sena running through a vibrant patch of flowers, followed by another girl, one calm and patient enough to balance out his daughter's endless energy. Perhaps they would laugh and talk and cry and share their deepest thoughts with one another. An honest, gentle bond that could never be strained by judgment or betrayal or selfish misdeeds. But something so pure and loving, something that might remain untainted by all the sorrows and cares of the declining world it resided in. Surely it could never ever truly exist. Never have I ever. And then Sena died for her friend. The end. The fuzzy cloud of her daydream slowly disappeared. She'd gotten lost in her memories again. It happened quite often these days, although she didn't mind. There were so many good memories stored away, like beautiful books in a library. It would be a shame not to pull them out and admire them now and again. Yeah, this is like way in the future now, isn't it? And she's been taking care of the sleeping Sena for like 50 years. After all, it would be so very lonely without them. Drawing back from the window, she slowly turned towards the old canopy bed, lying there so perfectly serene and peaceful, the ever-sleeping figure of her beautiful friend. Her chest slowly rose and fell with the same unchanging breaths, a constant rhythm. But she never once had she opened her eyes. Just gotta make her ascend! 6 years had passed since that night. There were no words for how Sena felt when she'd realized what she'd done. In trying to cure Esther, she'd pushed her into a deep coma, one from which there seemed to be no awakening. Hang on. Hold up a minute. Hang on. Wait a minute. Yep. The RFL agreed. The RFL agreed to put it all back into Esther. At first, Sena was beyond terrified. She didn't know how she could possibly care for Esther while she was in such a state. But after she carried her friend back to the manor, she stayed by her side for many painful days and nights. She realized something impossible had happened. Esther's body had gone into a strange, incredible stasis, requiring no food or drink. The very fundamentals of her biology had changed. And yet, for some unknowable reason, she continued to grow and age normally. It was as if the spirits themselves were sustaining her somehow. Or perhaps, as if she were living in a different world altogether, even though her body remained mirrored in this one. After she had cried all the tears she possibly could, and finally managed to control the guilt and anguish that plagued her, Sena slowly began to adapt again. She decided she would go on living and caring for Esther, waiting for her eventual awakening. The other girl's deep slumber was a constant reminder of her mistake, even though she didn't think Esther would have ever blamed her. Sena dreamed she would wake up with that wry, playful smile of hers and disarm every apology with a calm shake of her head. After such a long sleep, though, hopefully she would still remember all the time they'd spent together, and wouldn't look upon Sena as a stranger once more. But the more she studied her friend's peaceful face, the more Sena began to wonder something. She didn't really know if Esther was fully asleep. Perhaps part of her was still conscious. If that was the case, then it would be terribly lonely and quiet in the darkness. Most likely, she was far away in a dream, or in another place entirely. But just in case, Sena decided to always keep her company. After a few days of tinkering with a chair and an old wheelbarrow, she'd managed to create a sturdy wheelchair that could easily handle the forest floor. Now while she worked in the garden and the graveyard, Sena could take Esther along with her. As strange as it felt at first, she eventually began to chatter away just like before, describing the birds, the trees, the colors of the changing seasons. She would tell Esther how much she missed her, how excited she was to play and work together again, reminded her of her promise, and how cross she'd be if Esther never came back. She knitted you a sweater of tears, and you killed her. Sometimes a part of her wondered if she wasn't just going mad, and all of her efforts were utterly for naught. But if only there was the tiniest, faintest chance that Esther could hear her, that one day she'd open her eyes and smile again, sharing the same memories of those long, quiet years, then she would keep tending to her friend until the very end of their days. Settling down on the bed, she delicately cupped her palm against Esther's cheek, warm just like always, and her eyes so lightly closed as if they might flutter open at any moment. "It's another beautiful day, Esther. I'll pick some flowers for your hair today, I think." A tiny gentle smile traced over Seina's lips. If Esther could really hear her, Seina thought she might like that idea. Even if she wouldn't be able to see the flowers, she might feel their gentle weight on her head, or breathe in their fresh scent. And most importantly, she would know Seina was still with her, waiting for her to wake up. If you were cured of the pale, what's the first thing you think you'd do? Break my watch, I think. It stabbed me one too many times. With her friend's words always echoing in her mind, Seina kept Esther's watch with her wherever she went. So many times she dreamed of seeing Esther suddenly open her eyes before hurling her much despised medicine onto the ground. Even if the crash that startled Seina awake was an imaginary one, it sounded so vivid, so real and clear it almost felt like a premonition instead of a dream. Let's go then, shall we? The sun's getting bright and warm again, so I'll make sure to keep you in the shade. Maybe we'll stop by the stream too. I'll remember not to lose my ribbon this time. She murmured softly to Esther, pausing a few moments. A reply never came, but that didn't dishearten her or make her doubt what she knew to be true. She would keep her promise. She would wait for Esther to return. Perhaps it would be today, or tomorrow, or 20 years in the future. Perhaps it would be in another life altogether. No matter how long it took, Esther would always be there, waiting to welcome Esther back. As long as she always believed in it and never lost faith in their eternal promise, then one day they would be together again. Come to the sacrificial altar for a good time. Dovahkiin, Dovahkiin. So, like, I break writing down into 4 parts: characters, plot, world building, and minutia. The characters of this were very strong. Seina, Esther, and Isaiah. By keeping the cast small, they're very concentrated. They feel pretty real. I guess there's also Jeremiah if you want to count him. The plot, middling. You know, not a lot happens. There's a lot of, and then I read another note about what the backstory was. Like, you're just trundling around finding audio logs in a mediocre first-person horror game, you know? World building, there's some good world building. I think the world might be too similar to reality to effectively have the, or maybe it's too far from reality. It's too something from reality to have the magical realism elements of it. Like, normally with this sort of thing, there would be there would be a kind of, vagueness, an inconclusiveness on whether, you know, the Arafel were responsible. It would be like, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But in this, it's, you know, very clearly 100% yes. But the minutia. That's where this game struggles. Its over-reliance on adjectives and adverbs I've noted several times in the front half of the game. And in the back half, that reliance is still there, but now all of the more unusual adjectives and adverbs are being replaced by never ever. Well, never ever isn't really an adjective, but never evers and very varies and really reallys, and it's very it takes you out of the immersion. It kind of puts a crack in the suspension of disbelief. Like, come on, you've got this heightened vibe. You can't be using simple language like that. This is where purple prose is really appropriate, you know, when you've got this metaphysical, spiritual setting and the magical realism elements. Using very common language like very just feels wrong. But, like, the production values are really good. The art and the sound effects, you know, are really great. The music is... It's not great. It's functional, though. And overall, it is, like, a good game. It's certainly not the best of the visual novels I've played so far. That goes to Hello, Charlotte. But it's up there with, roughly, Who Killed My Father Academy, which I thought was also pretty good. You know, it's similar to that, but good and bad for different reasons. It's better than Four Horsemen. It's not the worst one. Oh boy, is it better than Dead and Breakfast? Carolyn Craft's Dead and Breakfast. Were there even any other like visual novels? I don't even. Oh, Golden Treasure. It's not as good as Golden Treasure. It doesn't even have the Om. Not matters, but the sacred syllable Om. And it doesn't have the math fish. How can you have a good story without the math eel? Oh my god, that got me hiccuping and burping. And they do a whole bunch of other things. No, you sucking my blood. Where the art is not as good. Got all the pictures. It's not like there's any choices, so like, how would you miss one? You done fucked up, Sana. Oh, look at that. You got... I was gonna say they all sound the same, and not like that. Yeah, so that's the game. So tomorrow, I believe it's back to Headlong Racing, I think? Let me double check. No, new game, Cubefall. Headlong Racing is Thursday. Good thing I checked. I don't know what Cubefall is. I just sort of picked it and was like, I need another game. So what's Cubefall like? Oh, yeah. It's an arcadey game. Rotate the squares to catch the falling cubes. Clear rows by catching blocks on every column. Yeah, that's kind of neat. Two modes, 3 difficulties, and 20 color palettes. So it probably won't be that long. But, like, it looks fun. Something just very gamey, though, after all that reading is really appreciated. And that's why I put it there. So yeah, see you tomorrow with Cubefall. That's